Hey everyone, Lance here. I wanted to make a video where I talked about the airflow issues that the case I have back here has. It's a Phanteks Evolv ATX, and people that know this case must know that while it looks amazing, it has really poor airflow. Some of the temps I'm getting are probably to the point where the tubing with my water cooling loop is getting damaged. Some of you may know that I've had 2 system leaks in this case. The second time the top piece of tubing bowed in the middle. Now it was due to a few other things, but the heat definitely sped things up. And I do quite often game for entire days at a time, and at the end of most days I'm seeing temperatures in the 80 to 85 degrees Celsius range on the first GPU, while the second GPU sits between the 65 and 75 degree mark. It's definitely a lot hotter than I'd want. They are 980 Ti's, but they are hot cards, but I definitely want it a lot cooler than that. Obviously you can remove panels, but that can also cause problems you might not even think of. Plus it ruins the whole aesthetic of the case. Now for my particular build, I have a 360mm radiator in the front and a 240mm radiator in the back 2/3 of the case. So I do have a big open area in the top there. Now since hot air rises, taking the lid off means you don't get the airflow across components. And while you may think that hot air would be bad, you still want that airflow, and you don't want hot air created by those other components to stagnate. Things such as the VRMs on the motherboard and the RAM, stuff like that. So movement of air is definitely a good thing. So what I'll be doing is of course keeping the lid on the case, but I want to block off any of the gaps that allow air into that top compartment. So only air that's going through the radiator can enter that top ceiling of the case. Now that's to make sure that the hot air that passes into the top doesn't flow back around. When it does flow back around, it causes a few other little issues, such as making the cooler intake air. While it is passing through a radiator, it's still cooler than the air in the top, but that air rolling back from the ceiling into the path of that intake air will warm that intake air up, causing the overall temperature in the motherboard tray to get hot. Because hot air does rise, it still needs somewhere to go, and if you can't get it out of the case, it's just going to cycle around in that top ceiling once that is blocked off. Now of course you still want to keep that air out of the motherboard tray. You don't want it coming in, going through here and then simply cycling back down here and creating this sort of flow. But you also don't want it to enter the top and flow around in here. It still needs to get out of that ceiling. So what I'm going to do is remove a few bits and pieces from the top of that case that you won't even notice, like some of these little vent grills here and also the plastic bit on the rear of the case back there too. Now if we look at my current setup of the case, the air is coming in the radiator here. Some will flow across components, but some can still freely go into the top here, and then it's got nowhere to go, or it's in the way of air that is passing through the radiator. So there's more air in the top that can move freely, so it's going to come in and it's going to create sort of this turbine effect here, with more hot air contaminating the main motherboard tray of the case and increasing overall temps of the system. Obviously with this idea that I'm going to implement here, the top of the case is going to be a lot hotter, but the hot air shouldn't flow downwards because, as I've said a couple of times already, hot air rises. Taking that side panel off the case also does a similar thing to having no lid on the case, as there's no pressure inside of the case, so there'll be no airflow across things like the motherboard and the RAM. This is also one of the main things keeping dust out when the system's not being used, and it gives the case the look that sort of made you buy it in the first place. Obviously you can take the side panel off, put it back on when you need, but it's nice and easy to just have a PC that you turn on and use without having to take things off just to be able to use it at an acceptable temperature. Now to get an idea, with this off or open, the air will come in the front here and it's free to flow outwards like this, so no air flows across components and not as much air would go through that radiator, cooling the coolant down before it eventually gets back to the front radiator. One other thing people like to do when they're trying to improve the airflow of a case is to flip the rear fan. Now I'm not going to do that, as the issue that can cause is that the top of the case isn't getting enough air out, the top of the case being in that lid that I talked about earlier. So flipping the fan is only going to increase the amount of air coming into the top of the case. So I'm going to leave it as an exhaust fan, and that's also going to help the problem of getting air out of the case. And as an exhaust fan, it means that we should hopefully have some air pulled out the rear and stop it going into the top of the case. Now of course, once we've figured out how we can get all of that air out, we can then look at ways we can get more air in. And of course we do need that air to come in, because there's no point trying to get air out if there's nothing coming in. There's nothing that's going to be able to be let out, and it's going to find ways to be sucked in through all the little gaps and cracks in the case, meaning that more dust is going to be sucked in. So people will know that there's very little space in this front panel. If I open the side panel, there's not even a finger size gap. Now the clips that hold this onto the front of the case, this front panel here, are simply screwed on. So I'm going to get longer screws and space them out, moving this front panel forward slightly. How far forward it's going to be, I'm not too sure yet. It'll depend how it looks. The further forward the better, but I don't want to ruin the overall aesthetic of the system. So that's probably enough talking for now, so let's get in and I'll show you some of these little tricks and things. I'm down in close and you can see that there's not really much clearance in that front panel there. So I've got some little washers here to space that out, just little flat washers. I've got about 8 in each pile here for each corner. And anyone that has this case will also be familiar with this little box of screws. So that box of screws comes with this case, and from that box of screws I've got these little things here. I don't know if it's going to focus, but they're little raised screws that have a little flange on them, and I'm going to be using those to space that front panel out. Taking it off, we can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 screws, and that holds this piece onto the front of the case. So using those washers, I'll be able to space that out and get a little bit more clearance on the front. If you wanted to, you could also take the fan filter off to get even more airflow through there, as there's quite a thick area across there of that plastic bit. With this off, all I'm going to be doing is undoing these 4 screws. Get these off. And with those 2 screws out, we have that piece there. And this screw will be able to bottom out with plenty of flange left on there, so I'll be able to put some washers on. So now I'll get my little pile of washers and place those on there, and the next pile, and then that simply goes there. And with these other screws, which, like I said, if you've got this case, you'll also have spare, and then of course do them up tight as well. And I'll do the other side, and then I'll put this on the case, and you'll be able to see how much clearance we now have on that front panel. That front panel is back on, and as you can see, I can now fit a whole finger in that slot there. So that's far more airflow that is going to be able to get into there. Now some people may not like as much spacing as I've done. It's right to the edge of everything else. I'll put the side panel on so you can get a better idea. Now you can see that with the side panel, I can still get a finger in there, but it's got quite decent clearance. So it still looks quite nice. If we look at it more side on, we can see that panel there. We can see the gap through there. We can only just see it. I'm pretty happy with how it looks like this as well, and I'll probably eventually get used to it and forget how it even looked before. That is probably the most difficult part of all of this, or all these little mods I'm doing. Next, all you really need to do is unscrew this small bit of plastic from the lid. I'll get in close and show you the lid with this off. Here's the inside of the lid of the case, and we simply want to remove this rear piece here. We can see where the 3 screw holes were, and we can also see how much extra space we get back here. Obviously there was grills there, but having all of this as free space opens it up just that tiny bit more to help get that air out of the case. If you wanted to, you could also remove this mesh along here. I've decided to leave it on just to help reduce dust settling in the case. We can see up here where that extra slot or vent is now that we've created by removing that piece. It's not huge, but it definitely opens that up a bit more. Here's the rear exhaust fan, and there's some exhaust kind of mesh back here that will allow air to flow out of the case. So now we've got a slightly larger area just by opening that up. Here's the top of the case without the lid on. Now obviously air will flow whichever way is easiest, so it's going to come in the front and some air is going to come up through all these little gaps here. So what we want to do, as I explained earlier, is block all of that off so it's only coming through the radiator to increase airflow across the components, and to also stop air that comes through the radiator to go back down this way and heat up the motherboard area or the main compartment of the case. So I've made this very tacky looking shield here, which will slot under here. I've just used some leftover cardboard I had from a vacuum cleaner box. You can use whatever cardboard you have. No one's going to ever see it when the lid's on. And that's blocked off all of those cavities except for where that 240mm radiator is. So air will come in, flow across the components. Hopefully more is directed out the back of the case, and then will also be directed through the radiator. Obviously this isn't perfect, but the whole idea of this is to use cheap stuff that I've got laying around the house. So now I'll put the lid back on and that will all be hidden away. And that's all the mods you really need to do. It's as easy as that. Some cheap and simple mods to this case really help improve that airflow. I'm really happy that now I can actually feel air being pushed out by this fan and even out through this little vent or these grills at the back here. I'm also really happy that that little slot in the top has some decent airflow coming out of it as well. And something to note is that without that cardboard shield in there that I made, the airflow is reduced to almost nothing out of that top section. So I'm really happy that that theory I'd come up with is actually true in practice. So I'm pretty pleased with myself there, and I'm sure it will benefit you guys as well. I've had valley looping for about an hour and we're sitting kind of at the mid 70 degrees Celsius range on the first card, high 50s on the second card, and low 60s on the CPU. So it is still pretty hot, but it's definitely cooler than before. I can put my hand in here and touch components and they're not feeling hot like it used to. Previously, if I physically touched any of the components, it was very, very hot, and even the air coming into the case felt really hot. But now, the air still feels cool coming out of the case. The air coming into the case through that front radiator is still reasonably cool. So even though the temperature is still hot on the cores, it's definitely come down quite a bit. And it's about 10 degrees less on the cores themselves compared to before. So I'm happy with that. And these GPUs were second hand and I didn't clean the blocks or reapply thermal paste when I bought them. It's probably well overdue and I'm hoping to do that soon. Yeah. But hey guys, that's all I really wanted to cover in this video. I do hope this helps some of you guys. It's definitely an interesting concept, sort of slightly modding the case to decrease the temperatures and increase the airflow. I hope it has helped some of you. And I do thank you all a lot for watching. Feel free to like, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram and Twitter. I'll put links in the description. But hey, I'll see you in the next one.